The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
The freedom of a people to choose its leaders is the root of liberty.
Keep alive this experiment in liberty.
Liberty, in case you've forgotten, is the soul's right to breathe.
Government should be very minimal in protecting liberty.
Peace cannot be purchased at the cost of liberty.
The sturdy ground of liberty.
Liberty once lost is lost forever.
Fight for their liberty and for our security.
Guarantees individual liberty.
This great republic, born alone in liberty.
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 Just how much do you want liberty?
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner,
a production of LibertyNation.com.
cutting through the double talk, taking on the topics, going after what the politicians really mean, and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Is America in the throes of a Marxist movement? If you listen to the people running Black Lives Matter, the answer is yes. Welcome back into Liberty Nation Radio, a production of LibertyNation.com, and heard from coast to coast on the Radio America Network. Today we'll discuss the true intentions of the suddenly mainstream Black Lives Matter, in the words of their own founders, which leave little doubt about their actual philosophy or their ultimate intentions. But despite the chaos which continues in the streets and the Democrats' refusal to stop it, Joe Biden continues to hold a big lead over President Trump in the polls. LibertyNation.com political columnist Joe Schaeffer jumps on board to discuss whether those polls should be a deep source of concern to the president or whether they're just illusory. Plus, LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza jumps on board to examine threats and promising developments regarding your individual liberty in Talkin' Liberty.
Say what? Say what? Say what? One more time.
We kick things off with our signature segment, Say What?, where we roll out a virtual assembly line of wacky, astonishing, damnable, and ultimately revealing things uttered by politicians and the chattering class. America's Marxist moment is upon us. Violence raging in the streets, largely unchecked by Democrats running the cities under siege, refusing to stop anything short of murder, it seems. And even then, in the occupied streets of Seattle, they aren't even allowed to attend to a person shot by who knows who in a nighttime war zone run by armed vigilantes dispensing street justice in a police-free environment. It's happening everywhere. And here's the answer from the left. Here's how it went down in the nation's largest city. Here's how the mayor and city council of New York bowed to the mob.
It's a win for Occupy City Hall. Protesters had camped outside of City Hall for nearly a week straight, and they were demanding the funding be cut.
The protesters here from Occupy City Hall are elated today after hearing that the mayor has sent over the city council a proposal to cut $1 million from the NYPD and then use that money on youth and social services. And the mayor is promising that he can do that and keep the city safe.
Bowing to the mob, that proposal became law. So we will now witness a massive social experiment of enormous magnitude. Less police protection in exchange for more social workers. That'll be tried on the guinea pigs known as the residents of the nation's largest city and arguably the most important city in the world. And it may be coming soon to a city near you. The evacuation of New York by civilized people with sufficient means to get out of Dodge is inevitable. But while supposed black rage is flowing through the streets of America, have you noticed that it's largely young white people who are in the midst of almost every violent episode we've been forced to witness, every statue toppled, every business destroyed, every innocent person standing in the way of these criminals? And it's no wonder when they're getting fed a steady diet of self-loathing white guilt from fearful white liberals in politics, academia, and the media who somehow believe burning, looting, tearing down monuments is justified. That attitude is typified by a man who started as a comedian and actually incredibly rose to become the most trusted source of news at one time, Jon Stewart.
We built a segregated system, and we built it up for 400 years. And just because we said it was over wasn't enough, we have to dismantle it in the same way that, with the same effort and the same vehemence that we built it. And we haven't done that. And by leaving those structures intact, like, we created the projects. We made it so that the class and race divisions were permanent. It was the law. And so rather than policing the borders of those structures, I feel like our efforts should be in dismantling them.
Translation: let's dismantle the system that made me, for one, free and rich beyond measure, because you must signal your virtue. Sad spectacle. Listen to Robert Johnson, arguably the most successful black man in America, founder of BET, Black Entertainment Television, put the white response to the chaos in the streets in perfect perspective.
The idea we're going to topple a statue because what? It's not going to close the wealth gap. It's not going to give a kid whose parents can't afford a college money to go to college. It's not going to close the labor gap between what white workers are paid and what black workers are paid. And it's not going to take people off welfare or food stamps. You know, it's people having fun that they can go out and pull down a statue and have the mistaken assumption that black people are sitting around cheering for them, say, oh my God, look at these white people. They're doing something so important to us. They're taking down a statue of a Civil War general who fought for the South. Black people laugh at white people who do this.
Bingo. So these criminal punks are out roving around, having a grand old time, smashing windows, looting, burning, intimidating, threatening, whoever they please. Democratic leaders are not stopping them. So rest assured you'll see more and more incidents like the one this week in St. Louis, where a man named Mark McCloskey brandished a weapon to protect what the police will no longer protect, his home, from an approaching mob. And to show you how the media's handling this, listen to how this homeowner was questioned and demonized by Chris Cuomo of CNN.
How do you feel about becoming the face of political resistance to the Black Lives Matter movement?
First of all, that's a completely ridiculous statement. I'm not the face of anything opposing the Black Lives Matter movement. I was a person scared for my life who was protecting my wife, my home, my hearth, my livelihood. I was a victim of a mob that came through the gate. I didn't care what color they were. I didn't care what their motivation was. I was in imminent fear that they would run me over, kill me, burn my house. And you have to have this in the context of St. Louis, where on June the 2nd of this year, I watched the city burn. I watched the 7-Eleven get smashed in, looted, and burned for 40 minutes on live television with nobody showing up to do anything. And I realized at that time we're on our own.
You were the one pointing a loaded weapon at a group of people who were walking past looking for the mayor's house as a point of protest.
Chris, that's an entirely false concept. No single media outlet has ever mentioned the complete falsity of that statement. The mayor's house cannot be reached through my neighborhood.
Lies, distortions, forget fake news. How about fake narratives? Like the one telling us that Black Lives Matter is interested in racial justice. We'll talk in the next segment about what they're really about by their own admission. Meanwhile, the COVID comeback, inevitable to some degree when states finally reopened after months of shutdown, has the media ushering Dr. Anthony Fauci back to the pedestal. But now he's getting open pushback from state leaders who no longer trust him, like the lieutenant governor of Texas, the largest state to see a COVID resurgence, Dan Patrick.
Fauci said today that he's concerned about states like Texas that skipped over certain things. He doesn't know what he's talking about. We haven't skipped over anything. The only thing I'm skipping over is listening to him. He has been wrong every time on every issue. I don't need his advice anymore. We'll listen to a lot of science. We'll listen to a lot of doctors. And Governor Abbott, myself, and other state leaders will make the decision. No, thank you, Dr. Fauci.
One thing I can tell you almost for sure. No Republican governors are going to shut down again. They will mitigate, protect, or isolate their most vulnerable populations. Democrat governors? Who knows? Quick break, and then we're back to examine, with more detail, America's Marxist moment.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com. With one click, you get tomorrow's news today with LNTV's Hot Topics and Analysis, Liberty Nation Radio, The Uprising and Rabbit Hole podcasts, and dozens of insightful original articles. And now, you can keep your kids ahead of the curve with LNGenZ.com. LN Gen Z brings a free-thinking education right into your home for students of every grade level with articles, videos, worksheets, and ready-to-go curricula. While the media establishment giants are sleeping, you can stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com and get tomorrow's news today. LibertyNation.com.
We believe that all men are entitled to blessings of liberty.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Nobody believes America's on the verge of transforming from a constitutional republic to pure, unadulterated Marxism. The thought's as inconceivable as it is chilling. But whether deliberately or not, the organization which has spearheaded the violent uprisings in the streets and demolition derby on our public monuments has now unmasked itself, not as a bunch of warriors for racial justice, as their name proclaims, but as Marxists to the core, the literal antithesis of all things American. Indeed, as violence rips the seams on the physical, social, and spiritual fabric of so many of the nation's great urban centers, the darkest fears of people who are still proud of the American project have been confirmed in two frightening statements over the last several days. One asserting the political philosophy of Black Lives Matter, and the other its ultimate intentions. Male and female co-founders of the organization have separately put the lie to the gullible white liberals' assertion that the Black Lives Matter Antifa anarchist radicals disrupting life across the nation are pursuing what their name transparently states: racial justice. They are not, unless you define such justice as a complete teardown of the existing order. What they really want is the dissolution of police, free elections, free speech, and every other fundamental constitutional protection, and ultimately violent overthrow of the America we know. If you're prone to dismiss this as an exaggeration, consider first this statement about the core beliefs of Black Lives Matter by their co-founder, Patrisse Cullors.
We actually do have an ideological frame. Myself and Alicia in particular are trained organizers. We are trained Marxists.
We are trained Marxists. There's no walking back a statement like that. Not that she would anyway. It's not like the Marxists and their anarchistic and nihilistic brothers and sisters tearing apart our inner cities are trying to hide their totalitarian intentions. But from that organizational ideology, we turn to the basic strategy for implementing it, or more precisely, enforcing it, from another Black Lives Matter co-founder and chair of the organization's New York branch, Hawk Newsom.
If this country doesn't give us what we want, then we will burn down this system and replace it. All right. And I could be speaking figuratively. Okay. I could be speaking literally. It's a matter of interpretation.
If this country doesn't give us what we want, then we will burn down this system and replace it. And if you've been listening up to this point, you know what the replacement would be. Is there any ambiguity in either their stated ideology or their chosen method for implementing it? You need look no further than the strewn wreckage of lives, communities, and businesses in the violent reign of terror following the George Floyd episode, accomplished with the indispensable aid and comfort of useful, self-loathing white idiots with their heads in the clouds and their hearts bent on mindless destruction of their own culture. And yet these naked truths about the people fomenting a race war in the land are conveniently ignored by the elite media, which has traded truth for open advocacy of anything marked with the stamp of progressive. They essentially advance a narrative that Donald Trump is a greater threat to the country than trained Marxists advancing on one target after another, unchecked by Democratic leaders fomenting civil war in the streets. Hello, wake-up call. These people are not about racial justice. They're totalitarians who hate America and are bent on destroying every freedom associated with it. A Marxist America will turn us into a hellhole, and you will become a prisoner in your own home. Think this is hyperbole? Consider the mind-bending trail of death and destruction in Marxist and communist regimes, past and present. Marxism being a political philosophy, communism the accompanying political system. Most of these communist regimes have now thankfully been banished to the ash heap of history following the implosion of the Soviet Union and the liberation of the enslaved nations of Eastern Europe. Only China, North Korea, Vietnam, Laos, and Cuba remain as Marxist-Leninist communist states. An accurate estimate, ladies and gentlemen, of the death toll under communism is impossible, but a reliable number from experts is over 100 million. Over 100 million dead under communism. The emblems of dehumanization are sickening to revisit. Forced labor, gulags, starvation wages, empty shelves, endemic poverty, secret police everywhere, no dissent permitted, no exit possible. This is the unvarnished truth of a century of Marxist tyranny. And this is what the co-founders of Black Lives Matter have now established as their goal for America. A governance of supposed white supremacy replaced by the iron rule of Marxist militants. Voters watched the strewn wreckage of lives, communities, and businesses nonchalantly demolished by these race warriors with the aid and comfort of Antifa anarchists, self-hating white nihilists, and the tacit, if not explicit, support of the Democratic Party and its progressive base and sycophantic media. Do these voters yet have any idea what's in store for them if these people are given the power to rule? And we'll be back to discuss how it can be that under all of these circumstances, the Democratic presidential candidate is running well ahead of President Trump.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Far more important than my political future and far more important than yours, the well-being of our country.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Chaos, anarchy in the streets, law enforcement helpless to respond as Democrats running urban America let the destruction continue. Now, you would think President Trump would benefit greatly simply by speaking out against criminal violence. And yet the polls show Joe Biden with a commanding lead. Yes, leading the race is the candidate of the party refusing to stop violence in the streets. refusing to stop the actual death of black people in Chicago and elsewhere, which escapes the notice of the organization that boldly wears the value of black people on its sleeve, Black Lives Matter, once considered radical and marginalized, now in the mainstream of thought among the elites controlling the news flow in this country. Here to try and explain this seeming conundrum, radicals running wild in the streets as voters express a preference for the party pointedly refusing to stop it, is the outspoken political columnist for LibertyNation.com, Joe Schaeffer. Hello, Joe.
Hello, Tim. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so say it ain't so, Joe. Explain how Joe Biden can not only be leading, but leading by a big margin in this racially charged environment, this cultural civil war. Do the voters actually side with the radicals because they support the general idea of racial justice?
I'll say it ain't so. It's just not so. Why? We were told to believe that Hillary Clinton was inevitable in 2016. Didn't happen. They're running the entire same playbook all over again. I just wrote an article this week about Charlie Gasparino at Fox Business Network, writing that Trump may drop out because the poll numbers are so horrible. And I showed there were 3 exact same articles written in 2016 in Politico, The Washington Post, and ABC News. The exact same articles. The template was entirely the same, written in August 2016 when Trump had just captured the nomination. And all 3 articles said, well, there's no evidence this is going to happen at all. Trump's not showing any signs of leaving. But, hey, he's going to leave. So they acknowledge it's not true, and then they run with it anyway. There was no reason to believe it in 2016, and there's no reason to believe it today. Joe Biden is not leading this race.
No doubt Donald Trump has spawned the most preposterous predictions over time and proven them all wrong, or most of them anyway. Now, let's get to the matter of this running mate for Joe Biden. Joe, will whatever progressive woman Joe Biden ultimately picks as his running mate ultimately help or hurt the ticket, given that she's likely to be allotted more power than any vice president in history?
Well, what I think is most interesting about it is it's an indication of weakness on the candidate himself's part. I think the best comparison is Walter Mondale in 1984. What did he have to lose? He was going against a popular incumbent president. And I'm willing to say Trump isn't as popular as Reagan was in 84 because Reagan was through the roof popular.
Yes.
But it was the same dynamic. Mondale was a weak candidate, looked like a loser. He had nothing to lose taking a progressive woman as his, and Ferraro wasn't as progressive as he's once today. But so it was kind of a rolling of the dice. Why not see it that way today? That this is really a desperation move on Biden's part. He's a classic uniparty establishment figure in a radical party. So he's throwing out this tidbit that I'm throwing him this bone, and he's going to get a radical woman. I've written a couple articles on some of the black females because it's identity politics. They want a woman. So, hey, let's get a minority woman. That's twice as good. Well, one of them, the mayor of Atlanta, Keisha Lance Bottoms, has ties with George Soros. And the other one, Karen Bass, who's head of the Congressional Black Caucus, is attending a conference next month that honored Louis Farrakhan last year as a conference on national reparations. This is going to scare the heck out of moderate voters if he goes down this road, and it looks like he's going to. So I think it's going to hurt him, but he's such a weak candidate. I think he has to do this anyway to build up support in his party. It's another sign to me that Joe Biden is not leading anything.
Well, let's look at it from the other side. The re-election effort of Donald Trump. What has he done or not done to be down double digits to a candidate perceived as one of the weakest in a long time?
Again, he's not down double digits. These polls are ridiculous. There's no reason to believe them. Do you know The Economist, that globalist rag website? They have the exact same thing the New York Times is running in 2016. Their model shows Joe Biden with a 91% chance of winning the election. So it says right now. You could go to their website right now. Joe Biden has a 91% chance of winning, according to them. Who believes this? There's no reason to believe this. That said, Donald Trump is doing some things wrong, in my opinion. He's listening to the type of advisors in the Republican side who are the very people he ran against in 2016. He needs to embrace the populist wave that got him elected. He needs to run hard on the wall and immigration and sticking up for the middle class against these radicals in the streets. I think he's getting some very terrible advice from establishment Republicans, and for whatever reason, he's listening to them. But there's still plenty of time for him to move away from that, and I do think he will as the summer moves on.
Can this situation for Trump really turn around the chaos in the streets if Democrats keep refusing to establish law and order in the cities they run, which are most all of the largest ones, or will the situation ultimately make things easier for Trump to be reelected?
Yeah, I think ultimately it's going to work out for him. We're such a culture of immediacy right now. Something happens in a 24-hour news cycle and we jump all over it. And then a week later or a month later, it's either forgotten or it's in a completely different situation. You know, the radicals are running wild right now. The establishment media is encouraging them for their own reasons. The elites love this. If you look at who is fanning the flames of what I call this cultural Marxist agitprop, I think that's the perfect word for it.
Yes, indeed.
It's the establishment media funded by some very powerful corporate and philanthropical names. They want this to happen for their own purposes. And so for that reason, it's not authentic. It's artificial. It's turning off more people than it's turning on, but the media won't let you know that. Eventually, once this whole thing kind of burns out because it's not real, Trump's going to be sitting pretty. What he needs to do now is show his followers, the people who elected him in 2016, that he is everything he said he was. He's not going to bow to the howling mob. He's going to stand up for traditional American values. He should just wrap himself up in the red, white, and blue and run with it. They'll make it easy for him to do that, and I expect him to do that.
Well, that's extremely well stated, Joe. Couldn't improve on it myself, but let me close with this question. A sense of how you think Trump over these 3.5 years has worn on the public writ large. Not the extremists that hate him, not the people who would vote for him even if he fired a shot down Fifth Avenue, but the rank and file voter. Good record until COVID threw everything into chaos, but a personality that offends a lot of people.
Well, I mean, he was always that way. He was that way in 2015. He was that before he got the nomination. He won the nomination. He was that way in 2016 before he got into the White House. He got into the White House. I don't think there's any reason to think there's anything different with that. I think as a president, he has that stature that Americans like in a president. It's funny because the media will tell you the complete opposite, but he looks presidential to me. He's got a lot of energy. He speaks well, even though they don't like a lot of things he says. And he comports himself, I believe, much more in a presidential manner than a Joe Biden, who is just the epitome of a uniparty swamp creature who's been there forever. I just think it would be an amazing thing if Joe Biden wins this election. It will be really the first time. We've had puppets as presidents before, of course, but you didn't see the strings as clearly. You have a dementia-riddled, gaffe-prone, lifetime Washington, D.C. politician running to be president. And if he wins, that is really going to be an amazing statement as to the state of the country. A clear establishment puppet will be in the White House. And I just don't think the American people want that. And that is what's going to help Trump the most.
Well, one of these days we'll get Joe to tell us what he really thinks. But in the meantime, we'll thank him once again for joining us. We'll be doing this, as we've said, with increasing frequency as November 3rd and the presidential election approaches. Thanks, Joe.
Thanks a lot.
Joe Schaeffer, political columnist for LibertyNation.com. Quick break, and then we're back with Talkin' Liberty.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
And now we have reached the portion of Liberty Nation Radio which we so desperately need in these times of Marxist revolt on the streets and chaos and bedlam. We need to restore some order. We're going to do it here on the show by reintroducing our guardian of individual liberty. He's the legal affairs editor of LibertyNation.com, constitutional lawyer, back with us again, Scott David Cosenza. Hello, Scott.
Hello, Tim. Thank you for that introduction.
Well, a lot that you need to protect us from, it, at least by informing us of the threats, which we hope to do in a unique way kind of here on the show, because these kind of stories that you cover tend to be overlooked. Now, one thing that wasn't this week, but which you pay close attention to as a constitutional lawyer, the Supreme Court of the United States overturning a Montana ban on money to religious schools.
This has the potential going forward to be a foundational ruling in school choice, Tim. Montana had a system whereby people could take a tax credit if they, I think it was $150, if they gave that much money instead of fulfilling their tax obligation to that tune. If they instead wrote a check to the scholarship fund, they could get out of paying that tax. So as a way to fund the scholarship funds with private funds, but it's a tax credit, so you're getting a relief on your tax. The problem was the people who got those scholarship funds, they could use them in private schools in Montana, families, and they tried to use it at a religious school, and the Montana Department of Revenue that was administering the program said absolutely not. The case is Montana v. Espinoza, and Ms. Espinoza has a kid, a daughter, who wants to use this scholarship to pay for a religiously affiliated school. State says no, they sue. Montana Supreme Court, Tim, says the Montana Revenue Department was correct in its finding that you can't pay this money to a religiously affiliated school. But also, that's illegal and violates the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. So the whole program now has to be shut down because of that. All right. Then it goes to federal court. We get to the Supreme Court, which came down with its decision this week. It's a 5-4 decision, and it says that the killing of the program in order to satisfy basically that it not discriminate against religious schools was incorrect, and that killing itself violated the right to free exercise and the Establishment Clause. So this Montana now has to restart that program and allow those funds to be spent at religiously affiliated schools. Roberts voted with the conservatives this time, so it's Roberts, Thomas, Alito.
You can toss a coin with the Chief Justice. One time he's with the liberal bloc, the next time he's with the constitutional bloc.
Somewhat of a surprise came from the left side of the bench, Tim, when Justice Ginsburg did not vote. The liberals did not vote as a bloc. Justice Ginsburg wrote separately, and hers was more of a procedural objection. And Breyer and Kagan voted together. And Sotomayor kind of wrote separately as well. Also, even in the conservative side, a lot of the justices wrote their own individual opinions. I think that Elena Kagan and Brett Kavanaugh are the only two justices who mercifully thought that we didn't need to hear from them individually on this issue. But it's very important because of what could happen from it. This one Montana program is very small, both in terms of dollar figure and number of human beings who are participating in it. It's the broader scope of what this means going forward, to build on this, to then perhaps get competition that allows people to take a voucher that the state gives them and go to a Catholic or other religious affiliated school and say, with the taxpayer dollar, educate my kid.
Basically, so people's kids aren't imprisoned in failing and dangerous inner city schools with no choice. I mean, this is something that's heavily supported by the black community. 80+% the Democrats stand against it, and yet they keep
Tim,
voting for Democrats.
Whenever they have one of these lotteries that one of these horrible neighborhood school people get to send their kid to like a private academy, there's a line around the block just for the application.
They're overrun.
And I talked to Dick Comer, who is the lead attorney for the winning side, who's an attorney for the Institute for Justice, or rather he was. He retired since the case was filed. But what he said to me was that he actually thinks this will improve public school if more competition is allowed, just because of how competition improves everything always.
It's simply human nature. And that hasn't changed, Scott, best I can tell, since the dawn of man. Now, SCOTUS also weighed in with an action that they didn't take. And here's where Chief Justice John Roberts comes in again. They overturned a Louisiana abortion law, scuttling the dreams of pro-lifers, and it's all on Chief Justice John Roberts. If you listen to the people who are disappointed, anywhere from disappointed to infuriated at their failure to uphold this law.
So there was a Texas decision a couple years ago where the Supreme Court overruled almost an identical law. Okay, and that the law we're talking about here says that an abortion provider has to have admitting privileges in a hospital, in this case, I think 30 miles from where their clinic is. Now, the legislative history on this basically says that they want to do this to frustrate the rights of abortion providers and those women who would seek abortions. This is not, as so many they proclaim, about women's health, for instance, except for the fact that in a more global sense they might argue that it's healthy for women to not have abortions, but they don't say that because that would be against Roe v. Wade, and it would be stricken down. So what they do is they try to couch it in some sort of thing like that there's unqualified people performing abortions or something like that, to try to get that hook, that medical hook. So anyway, the Supreme Court overrules that Texas law and says no way. Louisiana passes an almost identical law. And somehow, Tim, in the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, the Fifth Circuit upheld the law as being constitutional. I can't understand, just like the dissenting justice on the Fifth Circuit of three who ruled, I think, the right way, which is Supreme Court precedent in this area was crystal clear. So rarely do cases ever get to the Supreme Court. I mean, when I tell you that they modeled the one law after the other one, that's not a fabrication or hyperbole.
By all accounts,
it is almost like a word for word.
Yeah. So it's a copy and paste.
So the idea that kind of a challenge would get back up to the Supreme Court so soon after just being ruled on is a very odd thing. We don't have that. And so that's why, Tim, people were saying perhaps this could be a chance for a real sort of inroad against Roe v. Wade. That would be if Justice Roberts, for instance, wanted to go that way. There's a strong feeling that Justice Thomas, for instance, who's written about this, would happily peel back Roe, and Kavanaugh obviously is a Catholic, and who knows about Gorsuch, but that was sort of the feeling and why this had the potential to be a huge case.
Scott, there's also this matter of John Roberts and stare decisis, which is, respect for the precedent of the court. Now, 4 years ago, John Roberts voted against what he upheld this time. In other words, he was opposed to the decision 4 years ago, and now he authors a decision in the other direction, which does that not just prove that his loyalty seems to be to precedent in the court more than it is to his own interpretation of the law?
He is an institutionalist, and while I think his position is not correct and bad, it is defensible, I would say, that people have the court decisions to rely on for all sorts of reasons.
Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Tim.
This program, Liberty Nation Radio, and LibertyNation.com's own podcast, The Uprising, hosted by Scott. And then there's The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose, hosted by our own proper Brit, Mark Angelides. All available on demand at LibertyNation.com and from fine podcast providers everywhere. So that is it for this week, but we'll be back at you next week. A blessed Independence Day weekend, and we'll see you next time on Liberty Nation Radio.